coming up. In the months and years after 1940, it was widely believed by civilians, soldiers, and historians that the RAF essentially failed at Dunkirk. Many even went so far as to claim that the RAF was never even at Dunkirk in the first place. In this video, however, we will look at the historical documentation and the facts of this battle to determine if this commonly held belief about the missing RAF at Dunkirk is actually true. As we look back at the famous stories of history, the greatest events, and the most renowned leaders, we know most of the important details. But sometimes, in the cloudiness of history, these details that we have come to know as facts are simply wrong. Welcome to my new series, Debunked, where we will attempt to find out the truth in these widespread misconceptions. By the end of the spring of 1940, much of Europe was marred with the ugly scars of war, a war that was far from over. Hitler's forces were tearing through country after country with ease, leaving France's eventual fate more uncertain by the day. On May 10th, Hitler and his German forces launched their attack to the west, eventually shattering the Allied forces' lines with their newly developed high-speed tactics. The Germans trampled through the neutral lands of Belgium and marched from Luxembourg, pushing back the French and British forces there. In response, just 10 days later, a special unit of the Royal Air Force was formed. This group, called the Air Striking Force, was ordered to support the BEF troops and protect them however they could. Soon enough, the well-armed Luftwaffe, in addition to the German ground forces, pushed back the British, forcing the RAF pilots to evacuate with all the other troops on the ground. The British fighter squadrons were given the seemingly impossible task of providing air support for the BEF as they retreated back to England. However, the situation became dire when Hitler broke through the defenses, effectively blocking off the British and French supply ports. The outlook grew even darker as a sobering realization set in. There was only one city that could function as a possible evacuation route, a small seaside port nestled right along the Belgian-French border called Dunkirk. Here, Operation Dynamo officially began on May 26th of 1940. The following day, the RAF began their mission, which was, in short, to provide support for the Allied evacuation by monitoring and protecting the English Channel and the evacuation route from the Luftwaffe pilots above. This would include protecting the ships of the Royal Navy as well, because without these vital vessels, the troops would have no means to safely evacuate. Even without the pressure of the countless lives that were on the line, the inexperienced RAF pilots had to face off against the heart of the German Luftwaffe. A Luftwaffe which Hermann Göring had just bragged to Hitler would be able to easily take care of the BEF at Dunkirk. But, as he would soon see, not only would he fail to put together a strategically successful plan, but he would also vastly underestimate the RAF. Once the operation began and the British fighters took to the skies around the Channel and around Dunkirk, the RAF encountered German pilots in these areas frequently, often engaging in aerial combat. We know this to be true not only from first-hand accounts, but documented records and reports from the captains of various Royal Navy destroyers from this time. On May 31st, the commander of the Wyvern reported that they didn't have any interference from enemy action, but even still, when they later saw bombing going on ahead, they reported that the RAF appeared, stopping the attack shortly after. The next day, the Wyvern also saw another ship being attacked by German fighter pilots, and yet again the commander noted a very quick response time by the RAF to defend them. Thanks to their tireless efforts, the destroyers and other ships were able to reach the beaches with far less casualties. Despite the gratitude that many members of the Navy felt for these RAF pilots after seeing these actions, the sentiment did not exist on the ground among the BEF troops. As the end of the evacuation began drawing near on June 4th, all remaining British forces received orders to fall back and evacuate with the rest of the BEF. Naturally, this would include many of the RAF pilots that had survived being shot down and bailed out to be picked up by friendly troops. However, there was a cloud of disdain that had been brewing towards the RAF pilots. Many of the troops on the ground aggressively denied the RAF participating in the battle, citing the fact that there were no signs of aerial combat above or in the areas around Dunkirk. These accusations spread amongst the British Expeditionary Force like wildfire, igniting into even physical conflict between troops and downed pilots. So, why was this assumption so prevalent among these grounded British forces? Because after days of waiting on the beaches, already desperate for rescue and under a great deal of stress, the only planes that these men saw overhead were periodic attacks from Stukas and other German aircraft that wreaked havoc upon them. These BEF forces were sitting ducks for the German air attacks and were simply waiting wide open on the beaches of Dunkirk. Seeing these Luftwaffe bombers attack helpless British soldiers on the ground was likely excruciating and infuriating, especially when they almost always lacked any resistance from RAF fighters in the skies above them. Another possible cause for this assumption that the RAF did not adequately participate in the battle could stem from the fact that at the beginning of the conflict, the RAF initially was not there. As Germany launched their attack on France, the higher-ups in the British military were terrified at the realization that a German invasion was becoming more of a possibility by the day. Germany had, after all, just ripped across multiple nations, and Britain had to ensure its own safety. As such, the higher-ups did not want to risk sending in the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force to fight the Germans over France because it would be too much of a risk. They were Britain's only means of defense if Germany decided to launch an outright invasion of Britain. As the battle dragged on, they quickly decided to set out the Navy and RAF into battle, hoping that they would not have to worry about an invasion if Germany could be stopped here. In hindsight, however, there is a tragic irony in this myth that shows the truth of the matter, and it exists both in and of itself. As the BEF waited for rescue and evacuation, they rarely saw British fighters. The primary aircraft that they did see were a handful of German bombers coming to attack them on the beaches and in the shallow waters. The British Expeditionary Force expected to see intense dogfights in the skies above, with the British Hurricanes and Spitfires tangling with the German 109s and 110s. It is as though this confusion essentially stems from the assumption that the RAF's absence must have meant that they weren't involved nor fighting at all in the skies above, when, in reality, the fact that the RAF planes were not above Dunkirk and the fact that there was no large-scale aerial battles going on overhead indicates that the RAF was in fact doing exactly their job, which was to combat the Luftwaffe away from Dunkirk and out of the evacuation zones to keep the brunt of the German Air Force occupied in other locations. Because had the full force of the Luftwaffe been able to attack the BEF freely and openly on the ground, it would have likely been a slaughter for the Allied troops. But thanks to the valiant performance of the RAF in the skies well above and away from Dunkirk, this would not be the case. Unfortunately, the concrete records of the war wouldn't be widely accessible for years after, which allowed this rumor of the missing RAF to grow. Much like the other divisions of their military, in the evacuation of Dunkirk, the RAF sacrificed a great deal in order to protect their fellow soldiers and fulfilled their job to the best of their abilities. Throughout the 9 days of Operation Dynamo, the RAF completed a dizzying number of missions and battles. Their pilots executed 171 reconnaissance missions, 651 bombings, and 2,739 fighting sorties, which ultimately lost 177 of their own aircraft. As for the RAF, their fighter command force was whittled down to only 570 operational fighters, made up of 280 Spitfires and 290 Hurricanes. Even more so, many of their pilots had witnessed their friends and brothers shot down or killed in action. The efforts of the RAF were so valiant in Dunkirk that historian Dr. Joseph Quinn would write the following in a UK National Archives piece. It is therefore clear that the RAF made a tremendous effort and endured much sacrifice to provide air cover for the evacuation of the BEF through Operation Dynamo, almost to a point of imperiling the air defense of Britain itself. So, while we may have the documented proof dictating that the RAF was in fact present at the Battle of Dunkirk, the myth continues to persist to this very day. One can hope that with enough time, the understanding of the RAF will shift to seeing just how dedicated these pilots truly were to their cause, just like any of the other Allied forces. These men deserve to have their sacrifices remembered appropriately, and hopefully we can help debunk the myth of the missing RAF at Dunkirk.
Thank you guys so much for watching this historical recreation. If you want to support my content, please check out my fan store here and make sure to click subscribe right here. And if you want to go above and beyond, feel free to support me on Patreon, which can be found in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.